Hello YouTube. In this video we're going to look at externalist responses to skepticism. Now it's important to note that externalism is a broad program in epistemology. There are many reasons why people endorse externalism beyond its application to skepticism, but one of the benefits that is sometimes claimed for externalism is that it provides a response to skeptical challenges, and that's what we're going to look at here. Well, before we get going, quick advert. If you like my channel, you can support me on Patreon or send a donation on PayPal. I offer private tutoring. Please email if you're interested in that. And if you want to talk about these topics with anybody, join the Discord. The link for that will be in the description. Okay then. Externalism. What is externalism? Well, in epistemology, there is a distinction between internalism and externalism. These are different views of justification or knowledge. So according to internalists, justification is determined by a subject's internal states. A belief is justified only if the person who holds the belief is, or at least can be, aware of the reasons that support the belief. So if a belief is justified, I can have access to what makes the belief justified. I can present, at least to myself, the reasons that make the belief justified. So justification depends on factors internal to the person. According to externalism, by contrast, whether a person's belief is justified depends on factors external to the person. A belief can be justified even if the person holding the belief is not aware and cannot be aware of the reasons that support the belief. So take two people, Verity and Sydney. Suppose that Verity and Sydney are exactly alike mentally. They have exactly the same states of mind, exactly the same brain states, whatever. So they hold exactly the same beliefs. For instance, they both believe that Paris is the capital of France. Now, could it be the case that Verity's belief is justified while Sydney's belief is not? So that Verity knows that Paris is capital of France, while Sydney does not know this. Internalists are going to say no. If you've got exactly the same internal states, then the justification is going to be equivalent. Externalists, however, say yes, it could be possible, because as long as the external conditions are different, it might be that Verity has a justified belief that Paris is capital of France, while Sydney is unjustified in believing this. So, in order to explain, how this works, it will be helpful to just outline a couple of examples of externalism. So, I'm going to present two very simple forms of externalism. The point of this isn't really to get into the details of externalism. It's just to illustrate how the externalist response to skepticism works. So, here's one simple form of externalism. This is a kind of simple form of reliabilism. So, according to reliabilists, a belief is justified just in case it is the output of a reliable belief-forming process. That is, a process that tends to produce true beliefs. So we might say, for instance, that a subject knows that P, just in case the subject believes that P is true, and P is the output of a reliable belief-forming process, by which we mean a process that tends to produce a high proportion of true beliefs. So, I believe that I have hands. This belief is formed on the basis of visual perception, and visual perception tends to deliver true beliefs. So visual perception is a reliable process. So on this sort of view, my belief is justified, and I know that I have hands. I have knowledge that I have hands. Another option is the truth tracking account. So on this account, my belief is justified just in case it tracks the truth, and this is understood in terms of certain counterfactual conditionals. So we might say that a subject S knows that P just in case S believes that P is true, and if P were not true, S would not believe it. This is sometimes called the sensitivity condition. We say that the subject's belief that P is justified just in case things are such that if P were not true, S would not believe it. Like if you change P to a falsehood, then S's belief is going to change as well. So again, I believe that I have hands, and why do I believe this? Well, I believe this because there's light. So what's actually happening in the external world, we take it, is that light is reflecting off my hands into my eyes. That's creating a particular visual appearance. Now, if my hands were not there, then light would instead be reflecting off of two stumps on my arms, and I would not believe that I have hands. I'd look down and I'd see these two stumps, and I would not form the belief that I have hands. I'd believe that I do not have hands. So, if we sort of remove hands from the equation, if it were not true that I have hands, then I would not believe that I have hands. And this is to say that my belief that I have hands tracks the truth about whether or not I have hands. Yeah, I mean, these are just two simple forms of externalism. Now, there are many things to be said for and against these approaches to justification and knowledge. The key point for our purposes is that if these sorts of views are on the right track, then whether my beliefs are justified is going to depend on external conditions. So provided that the right external condition is satisfied, my beliefs will be justified. So provided my beliefs have been formed by a reliable process, for instance, those beliefs are justified, or those beliefs count as knowledge. I don't need to know anything about what this process is, or about what makes it reliable. It's enough for there to just be some reliable process. Okay, so it's sometimes said then that one of the benefits of externalism is that it provides a response to skepticism. So to illustrate this, let's consider a classic skeptical argument concerning the external world. If I don't know I'm not a brain in a vat, then I don't know I have hands. I don't know I'm not a brain in a vat, so I don't know I have hands. The general idea of this argument then is that the skeptic is appealing to some skeptical hypothesis which is logically compatible with all of your experiences. All of your experiences to date are compatible with your being a brain in a vat. Your experiences alone do not favour, or at least they don't seem to decide between either the common sense hypothesis that there's an external world as it seems to be, or the brain in the vat hypothesis. Now, the skeptic says that in order to have knowledge of the external world, you need to rule out these skeptical hypotheses. But that's not going to be an easy job. It doesn't seem like there is a way to rule out these skeptical hypotheses, so we do not have knowledge of the external world. Right? You don't know that you have hands. Okay, so what's an internalist going to say about this argument? Well, there are various options for an internalist. I mean, an internalist might appeal to inference to the best explanation to try to show that skeptical hypotheses are defective in some way. That the common sense hypothesis is a better explanation for the appearances than the skeptical hypothesis. Or the internalist might propose a Morean argument. She might claim that the fact that I know I have hands, that's more plausible, or the proposition that I know I have hands is more plausible than any philosophical proposition in a skeptical argument to the contrary. I have videos on these responses to skepticism, which I will link in the comments. But the key thing to notice is that, look, although internalists do have responses to skepticism, it's a really difficult problem, and it's really not clear that any of these responses are particularly satisfying. It's not clear that they work. I mean, the internalist has a really tough time with these sorts of skeptical arguments, and the reason why is because, look, it seems like these skeptical hypotheses are logically compatible with all of your experiences. It seems like your experiences, so the experiences of the brain in the vat could be exactly the same as your experiences. So how the hell are you going to rule out that you're a brain in a vat, right? That's basically the issue. Now, the externalist, by contrast, has a rather straightforward answer to these sorts of arguments. In fact, the externalist can deny both premise 1 and premise 2. So let's consider reliabilism. Okay, I believe that I have hands. Do I know that I have hands? Well, recall that for a reliabilist, a true belief is going to count as knowledge, or a true belief is going to count as justified, just in case it is the output of a reliable process, just in case it's the output of a process that tends to produce true beliefs. Moreover, my belief that I have hands is the output of a reliable process. I formed this belief on the basis of visual perception. plus, I mean, I suppose other forms of perception and testimony from, other people and so on. But, okay, one source of it is visual perception, and visual perception is a reliable process of belief formation. So my belief that I have hands is, it's a true belief, and it was produced by a reliable belief forming process, so it counts as knowledge. I know that I have hands. Now, importantly, from a reliabilist point of view, I don't need to rule out alternative skeptical hypotheses about the source of my experience. So, I mean, maybe I have no reason for believing that, the brain in the vat hypothesis is not true. But so what? According to the reliabilist, in order to know that I have hands, all that is required is that my true belief that I have hands was produced by a reliable belief forming process. So more generally, for the externalist, all that's required for me to know that I have hands is that some external condition is satisfied. So I don't really need to have any reasons whatsoever for my belief that I have hands. I don't need to reflect on this belief. I don't need to consider alternatives. I don't need to be able to distinguish my own position from the position of a brain in a vat or anything like that. All that's required is that I have a true belief produced by a reliable mechanism. Now, of course, nothing stops me from presenting reasons for my belief or reflecting on the belief or considering alternatives and trying to rule them out. Nothing stops me from doing that stuff if I want to, but the point is I don't need to. You can have knowledge without doing any of that stuff. So you can know that you have hands just by forming the belief as a result of a reliable belief forming process. You don't need to do anything more. So what that means then is that premise one of the skeptical argument is false. Even if I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat, I can still know that I have hands. And then alternatively, I might come to the belief that I'm not a brain in a vat, and provided this belief was formed by a reliable process, it also counts as knowledge. So if I, observe my surroundings and I see what looks like hands and trees and cars and computers, and then I infer, oh, I'm in a body and I'm, wandering around in a street, so I'm not a brain in a vat. Well, that's also going to count as knowledge because, it was formed on the basis of this reliable process. So premise two is false. I do know that I'm not a brain in a vat. So, okay, I mean, hopefully you can see how this general move is going to work, right? The point is that really you don't need to have any particular reason that you can cite for your beliefs. What is relevant is that there's some sort of external process or external condition that is satisfied. As long as you have a true belief and it was produced in the right kind of way, then you have knowledge. And so this is going to give us there's like a general move here that can be made in response to other types of skeptical arguments. So if you look at, the problem of the criterion or Agrippa's trilemma or, Hume's argument against reason or whatever, somebody who's a reliabilist can say, well, a true belief counts as knowledge just in case that belief is the output of a reliable process. I believe I have hands. It's true that I have hands, and my belief that I have hands is the output of a reliable process. So, I mean, I don't need any reason for thinking that I'm not being deceived. I don't need any reason for favouring my beliefs over other potential beliefs. I don't need any further answer to any of these skeptical arguments. I know I have hands, right? Problem solved. So there we have it. Externalism gives us a straightforward answer to skepticism. For any belief P that comes under skeptical pressure, the externalist can assert that P is true and that the relevant external condition with respect to P is satisfied. Thus, I know that P. Now, most people, when they encounter this answer, feel like there's something fishy about it. It seems to miss the point in some sort of way, or it seems too quick and easy. It seems to make knowledge too easy. So a lot of philosophers feel that the response that the externalist gives to the skeptic is implausible, and in the rest of this video I want to elaborate on this. We're going to ask, what exactly is it that is wrong with this kind of response? Now there are many different ways of spelling this out. So Michael Bergman, in his article Externalist Responses to Skepticism, presents 4 different ways of spelling it out. I'm going to modify his taxonomy a bit and present a few others. So I'm going to present at least 7 ways of spelling out what might be wrong with this response. Okay then, one way to develop the idea there's something fishy about the externalist response. So we might say, okay, look, externalism in itself doesn't actually provide a response. Like there isn't a response here. So I could endorse externalism as an analysis of knowledge, but then deny or suspend judgment about whether the relevant external conditions obtain. So I could endorse the claim that to know that P is to have the true belief that P produced by a reliable process, but then I deny or suspend judgment about whether any given belief is in fact produced by a reliable process. In order to answer the skeptic, the reliabilist has to include the assertion that her belief-forming processes are in fact reliable. But this is what is being put into question by the skeptic. The skeptic is giving you a scenario where you have exactly the same experiences, but your belief-forming processes are not reliable. So isn't it question-begging in this context to just assert that your belief-forming processes are reliable? Well, I mean, that's one thing we might say. On the other hand, the reliabilist, might object like this. She might say, well, we come into inquiry with certain beliefs, including the belief that certain belief-forming processes are reliable. If the skeptical argument is successful, then we're going to have to abandon that belief. So if the skeptical argument is successful, then I'm going to have to abandon my belief that certain belief-forming processes are reliable. But from the reliabilist point of view, the skeptical argument isn't successful, because the first premise of the skeptical argument is false, right? I don't need to rule out skeptical hypotheses in order to know that I have hands. And moreover, given our initial assumptions, the second premise is false as well. I do know I'm not a brain in a vat because I believe I'm not a brain in a vat, and that belief was produced by a reliable belief-forming process. So it's not question begging. I'm just, the reliabilist, is not begging the question when she says that her belief-forming processes are reliable. She just isn't moved by by certain premises in the skeptical argument, which aims to undermine her belief. So maybe that's a response to that. Okay, a second way to present this problem is to say that the externalist provides only a conditional answer to skepticism. What we get on reliabilism, for instance, is that if visual perception is reliable, then I can know that I have hands. In general, if my beliefs satisfy the relevant external conditions, then those beliefs are justified. But what's in question here is whether my beliefs satisfy those external conditions. So the reliabilist affirms that all that's required for knowledge of the external world is that our beliefs about the external world are the output of reliable processes. And then she adds, those beliefs are in fact the output of reliable processes. Now maybe this doesn't beg the question against the skeptic, but it does invite an obvious response, which is, well, how do you know that those processes are reliable? How do you know that visual perception tends to produce true beliefs? After all, if you were a brain in a vat, you would make exactly the same assumption. You would think that visual perception was reliable, and you would be drawing on exactly the same experiences to make that conclusion. But you would be wrong. So there's nothing in your experience that distinguishes the external world hypothesis from the brain in the vat hypothesis. The brain in the vat is like in the same is subject to the same experience as you, but forms this incorrect conclusion. She incorrectly thinks that her visual perception is reliable. So, okay, so maybe this is the issue here is that, like, okay, how do you know that visual perception is reliable? Now, the externalist does have an answer to this, of course. The externalist can say one of two things. The first thing she can say is, well, she can deny that she needs to know that her belief-forming processes are reliable. It's enough that they are reliable. As long as they are reliable, her beliefs will count as knowledge. And to insist that she be able to show that her belief-forming processes are reliable, that's just to presuppose internalism. But she's an externalist, so she just doesn't need to do that. The second thing she can say is that she does know that her belief-forming processes are reliable. Her belief that her belief-forming processes are reliable is itself the output of a reliable belief-forming process. Therefore, it counts as knowledge. So, either way, though, the externalist isn't giving a mere conditional answer to the skeptic. She's not merely saying, well, if my beliefs satisfy the relevant external conditions, then those beliefs are justified. She's giving us an account on which her beliefs are in fact justified. She's giving an account on which, she does in fact know that she has hands. So, yeah, that's the externalist response to that. Okay then, a third way to present the problem is to say that the externalist's response to the skeptic is objectionably circular. Consider visual perception. So, I say that visual perception is reliable. Why is this, right? What is it that's leading me to say that visual perception is reliable? Well, in the past, I formed beliefs on the basis of visual perception, and those beliefs turned out to be true. So at time t1, I formed the belief that I have hands by seeing my hands. Then at a later time t2, I confirmed that I have hands. Again, by seeing that I have hands, or by seeing photographs of myself, with my hands in the photographs. And so on, right? There's been countless times when beliefs formed through visual perception have been confirmed to be true. That's why I think visual perception is reliable. Now, of course, this argument that I've just given partly relies on visual perception, plus memory and introspection and so on. Now, suppose that, so what I'm doing here then is I'm sort of using visual perception to establish the reliability of visual perception. Now, suppose that these cognitive mechanisms are in fact reliable. Like, suppose that visual perception is in fact reliable. Well then, for the reliabilist, beliefs formed on the basis of such mechanisms are justified. So what I've presented there is in fact a good argument. Like, okay, how do I know visual perception is reliable? Well, because visual perception has a good track record. I can recall that visual perception tended to produce true beliefs. This judgment is itself based on visual perception. I'm using visual perception to establish the reliability of visual perception. Now, in general, the reliability of a process is sufficient to justify beliefs formed by that process, but then we can use those justified beliefs to form a justified belief about the reliability of the process. But that whole procedure just seems obviously circular. So Richard Fumerton in Meta-Epistemology and Skepticism puts it this way. He says, you cannot use perception to justify the reliability of perception. You cannot use memory to justify the reliability of memory. You cannot use induction to justify the reliability of induction. Such attempts to respond to the skeptic's concerns involve blatant, indeed pathetic, circularity. So this sort of worry is expressed in a bit more detail by Jonathan Vogel in the paper Reliabilism Leveled. He gives the example of Roxanne. Roxanne has a car with a reliable petrol gauge, and she trusts what the gauge tells her. But then one day she is challenged about why she trusts the gauge. Like, how does she know that the gauge is not faulty? And, Roxanne worries about this. She wants to be epistemically responsible. She doesn't want to just trust the gauge blindly. She wants to, she wants to know the proposition the gauge is reliable. So she decides to investigate. And here's how she proceeds. She looks at the gauge, and on the basis of her observation, she forms a belief about both the reading of the gauge and how much petrol is in the tank. So she looks at the gauge, and let's say the gauge reads full. Well, when the gauge reads full, she forms the belief that, first of all, the gauge reads full, and second, the petrol tank is full. So that is, she believes, on this occasion, the gauge reads full and the petrol tank is full. Now, from a reliabilist point of view, this is all perfectly legitimate. Roxanne forms beliefs about the gauge on the basis of visual perception, which we can just assume is reliable for our purposes. But moreover, we're also assuming that the gauge is in fact a reliable indicator of the tank. So the process by which Roxanne forms the belief that the tank is full, using the readings on the gauge, that's reliable, so her belief is justified. She knows that the petrol tank is full. So she knows that the gauge reads full and that the petrol tank is full. Okay, so Roxanne can now repeat this process over and over again, and she can form various beliefs of the form, on this occasion, the gauge reads X and the petrol tank is X. And after repeating this many times and seeing the correlation between, what the gauge reads and what the tank is doing, she concludes that the gauge is reliable. So she has her answer to the gauge skeptic. She can say, I am justified in believing that the gauge is reliable. I know that the gauge is reliable. But this just seems ridiculous. I mean, this seems to be clearly viciously circular. Now, actually, just a quick word of warning about this example. I think this example could be a bit misleading because in practice, we have all kinds of other ways of confirming the reliability of a car's petrol gauge. I might observe that after I fill a tank with petrol at the petrol station, I get back in the car and the gauge reads full. So in this example, though, we have to assume that no information like that is available to Roxanne. Indeed, it might be better to imagine that Roxanne is just looking at a gauge on a computer, and she's told that this gauge is giving information about a car that's being driven by somebody else. But all she sees is like numbers on a computer screen or whatever. So like she's not even interacting with the car in any way. She's just given some numbers on a computer screen. She's told that this is a petrol gauge of some car, somebody's car. But then she goes through the same process to form the belief that the gauge is in fact a reliable indicator of the petrol tank in this person's car. In that context, it really seems absurd to say that Roxanne knows that the gauge is reliable, but it looks like her whole procedure is fine, right? Like everything, all of the steps are totally legit on the reliabilist view, at least. So this is the problem, right? Like the objection is going to be, well, if we accept the externalist move with respect to skepticism, then it looks like we can form knowledge in this just like really clearly circular way. Like the externalist move is just going to be viciously circular. And this also suggests, okay, so this point about forming beliefs from this petrol gauge suggests a fourth way to present the problem, which is a kind of companions in guilt problem. So basically we can point out that almost any method of belief formation could be defended from skeptical doubt in an externalist way. The externalist says that ordinary beliefs about the world are justified on the grounds that these beliefs meet particular external conditions. Now suppose I form beliefs by gazing into a crystal ball. And then in response to skeptical challenges, I simply point out, well, the crystal ball tends to deliver true beliefs. It is a reliable method of belief formation, so my beliefs formed this way are justified. I don't need to give any reason for thinking the crystal ball is reliable. I don't need to give any reason for thinking the external conditions are satisfied. It's enough that they are satisfied. So, as it happens, I believe that they are satisfied, and that's enough, right? It's enough that the crystal ball is a reliable process. And by the way, I think it is a reliable process. So that's my answer to the skeptical challenge. Now, of course, if I'm pressed to give a further reason why I take the crystal ball to be a reliable method of belief formation, I could gaze into the crystal ball and see that it confirms its own reliability. Like the crystal ball says, yes, I am reliable. Now, if this sort of move isn't convincing in the case of the crystal ball, why on earth would it be convincing in the case of the methods of belief formation that we use, like perception? Like it seems like what the crystal ball gazer is doing is exactly what the ordinary externalist is doing with respect to perception. But I don't think anyone would find this convincing in the case of the crystal ball. So, okay, it doesn't seem like a legitimate move in the case of perception. Okay, there's another type of companions in guilt problem here. So the first companions in guilt problem is that the externalist response to the skeptic can be deployed in defense of almost any method of belief formation, like crystal ball gazing. The second companions in guilt problem is that the externalist response to skepticism, if it works against skepticism, can work against almost any argument whatsoever. So in other words, what the externalist has given us is not a response to skepticism specifically, but a response to almost any argument against one's position. It's a response to almost any criticism. but that's sort of too broad, right? Like you shouldn't be able to just give a kind of easy answer to any argument against your position. So let's see how this problem works. Let's consider reliabilism again. So there's lots of different challenges to reliabilism. One challenge to reliabilism is known as the generality problem, and basically this is the problem of how we are to demarcate different cognitive mechanisms. The reliabilist says that a belief is justified if it is produced by a mechanism that tends to produce true beliefs. Now, I believe that I have hands. Okay, so what's the mechanism that produced this belief? Notice that there are all sorts of things we could say here. So we could say, well, the belief was produced by visual perception. And we just leave it at that, right? There's this mechanism of visual perception. Or we could say, well, it's visual perception under normal conditions, right? So there's a difference between visual perception under normal conditions and then visual perception in other types of contexts. Or we could be we could be more specific. We could say there's visual perception at a particular time of day with particular lighting conditions, given a particular body temperature. Like, we could really specify very precisely the conditions in question. Now, clearly, different ways of defining what counts as the relevant cognitive mechanism are going to lead to different assessments about whether that mechanism tends to produce true beliefs. Because it could be that visual perception in general is actually unreliable, but that visual perception in specific conditions or visual perception of specific types of things is reliable. So like, it might be that when you are in the right kinds of conditions, visual perception tends to produce true beliefs, or visual perception might be unreliable with respect to color, but reliable with respect to shape, or something like that. So the different ways of specifying what the cognitive mechanism is are going to lead to different assessments of its reliability. And so this seems like a problem. The reliabilist needs to say something about how we actually demarcate cognitive mechanisms. There has to be some sort of, I suppose, objective way of doing this. Now, this isn't a skeptical problem, right? Like, non-skeptics can forward this problem. Anybody who is, anybody, even other externalists, anybody who has concerns about reliabilism can forward this problem. And it does seem to be a genuine issue that reliabilists need to deal with. But then we might say, well, hang on a minute. The reliabilist could, at this point, just dismiss this problem by appealing to the usual externalist response to skepticism. She could just grant that she has no answer to the problem, but then say that, well, look, as a reliabilist, I'm assuming that whatever mechanisms produce my beliefs are in fact reliable. So there must be a solution to the generality problem, even though I'm not aware of it. And I don't need to be aware of the solution in order for my belief in reliabilism to count as reliable. All that matters is that the belief is a product of a reliable process. That's it. That's all that matters. I don't need to have answers to challenges to the belief. So similarly, the reliabilist doesn't need to be aware of any reason to reject alternative skeptical hypotheses like the brain in the vat hypothesis in order for her belief that she has hands to be reliable. She just doesn't need to know exactly how to demarcate different cognitive mechanisms. She doesn't need to know exactly how it is that the cognitive mechanisms that produce her beliefs, she doesn't need to know how it is that they're reliable or anything like that. It's enough that they are reliable. And then it looks like, well, this same sort of move could be made in response to pretty much any objection that we raise against the position. But that can't be, that can't be right. That at that point now it just seems like this is just completely sort of, anti-intellectual, right? Like, you shouldn't be able to just dismiss any criticism at all in such an easy way. So this might be a concern, that if we sign on for the externalist response to skepticism, well, what we actually get is a response to any criticism whatsoever. But that's clearly that's clearly unacceptable. Okay then, a sixth way of spelling out the problem with the externalist response is that it suffers from a kind of dialectical inefficiency. Let's say that you are an externalist and you believe that the relevant external conditions obtain. You believe that some of your beliefs are formed by a reliable process. Okay, well that's well and good. But what about me? I mean, suppose that I'm in a state of doubt about this. I'm in a state of doubt about whether, for instance, my perceptual faculties are reliable. So I'm doubting whether, I have hands, for instance. What can externalism offer me to move me out of that doubt? So, it might be that the standard argument for skepticism fails, right? Maybe the standard argument for skepticism is not, in fact, a sound argument. The externalist can, given her background beliefs, she can reject both premises of the argument. But just as a sort of psychological matter, it might happen to me that as soon as I realise that my experiences are compatible with a host of skeptical hypotheses, I experience doubts. I just start to doubt my common sense beliefs. So once I realise that my experiences are compatible with me being a brain in a vat, I come to doubt whether my faculties are reliable. Now, you can insist that there's no, good reason or good argument for my doubt. But the point here is not whether I can justify my doubt. The point is that I am now in a state of doubt and I want to get out of it. And that, you might think, is the real skeptical challenge, right? The challenge is, okay, so I'm in this position where I'm just in a state of doubt about whether my faculties are reliable. How do I get out of that? How do I become confident again that my faculties are reliable? How do I become confident again that I do have hands? That's the question I want answered. Resolving the challenge of skepticism, it's not simply a matter of being able to identify to your own satisfaction some premise in the skeptical argument that goes wrong. What is required here, what is wanted as an answer is getting me out of the state of doubt, resolving this doubt. Now, there are things an externalist can say. She can give me arguments that might push me to increase my confidence in the common sense view that my faculties are reliable. She can, she can give a Morean argument perhaps, or she might give an inference to the best explanation. But of course, these are arguments that an internalist can give as well. The externalist has absolutely nothing to say as an externalist. The externalist qua externalist has nothing to offer here. So if you are already confident that visual perception is reliable, then maybe externalism gives you a way to dismiss the skeptical argument. But if you are already confident that visual perception is reliable, then you do not have skeptical doubts in the first place. If you're not already confident that visual perception is reliable, if you're taking seriously the possibility that, maybe my experiences are just the result of some massive deception, well, externalism isn't going to have any force whatsoever for you. What the externalist response to skepticism amounts to, then, is that the externalist can tell herself that she knows that she has hands. But that's as far as it goes. So this is the thought that it's going to be dialectically ineffective against anybody who has skeptical doubts, and this is why the externalist response seems so weak. I guess it's not just that it's dialectically ineffective against somebody who has skeptical doubts. It's also that actually loads of people can end up in a state of skeptical doubt, right? It seems that, reflecting on things like the brain in the vat hypothesis and other skeptical hypotheses, that sort of just pushes a lot of people into a state of doubt. It's not just crazy people or whatever that we're unable to reach. There's lots of, very reasonable, very smart people who just end up in this state of doubt, and externalism offers nothing to them. And we can push this problem a little bit further by noticing that the externalist doesn't need to encounter a skeptical interlocutor. She can imagine talking to a skeptic, or she can pretend to be a skeptic herself. I mean, I take it that anybody with even a little imagination can do this, right? Even if you believe in the common sense view and you believe that your faculties are reliable, you can imagine, being pushed into a state of doubt. And then you can ask yourself, well, what am I supposed to say to myself to get rid of those doubts? Externalism isn't going to help you. And maybe this is why the externalist response is unconvincing. Okay then, a final way to present the problem with the externalist response is to appeal to a sort of brute intuition. So we might say, well, look, the externalist's response to skepticism is really easy. But skepticism clearly isn't an easy problem. Skepticism is this deep challenge that has been at the centre of epistemology for thousands of years. It's prompted a variety of different responses. It serves as a foil for various epistemological positions. Almost every epistemologist will deal with skepticism in one way or another. And sort of reflecting on the the reliability of our own methods of forming beliefs. I mean, this is one of the few philosophical issues that occasionally grips laypersons. Think about the influence of movies like The Matrix. I remember when I was a young kid, I would sometimes reflect on skeptical hypotheses like the brain in the vat hypothesis. And arguably, sort of this kind of skeptical challenges of the usual methods of belief formation. This maybe has even played a role in the development of other disciplines. Like in science, in the sciences, when we sort of try to come up with different ways of calibrating. Different ways of kind of calibrating our instruments and making sure that we don't just kind of trust that some instrument is delivering reliable results, for instance, so yeah, I mean, skepticism, these skeptical challenges sort of arise everywhere, and they present a deep challenge. And the fact that externalism deals with skepticism so quickly and easily, the fact that it furnishes such an easy response, that is in itself a reason to be suspicious of this response, right? That's just in itself deeply counterintuitive. So there you have it. 7 ways of elaborating on the idea that the externalist response to skepticism is too quick or too easy. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much all I wanted to do in this video. Now, I do want to note, incidentally, that it may be the case that some of these issues apply to certain forms of internalism as well. Actually, Michael Bergman, in the article I mentioned earlier, Externalist Responses to Skepticism, he argues that the most sort of plausible forms of internalism are actually subject to exactly the same problems that externalism is. So, I mean, this might be... maybe this is a more general issue, but I think that, as I said, there are a lot of philosophers who are suspicious of the externalist response in particular, and I've just tried to elaborate on why that might be, why it is that the externalist response seems suspiciously easy. Okay, and that's all I wanted to talk about, so I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.